So, good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Cindy Cleghorn. I'm the chair for Plan Check NC. Normally, Plan Check meets on the second Saturday of every month, so we're happy to be here in Glassell Park. Thank you very much. And we encourage you, as after today, to continue your planning education by coming out to Plan Check on second Saturdays of the month. And we can tell you more about that later, but we want to get our day started here today. And I also want to let you know that we want to know who everyone is here, so that our planning department representatives know who you are and each other. So in about an hour, be prepared to let us know who you are and what community you're from and things like that. So at this time, I'm happy to introduce our speakers today, which is Craig and Heidi from the planning department. So if they want to come up and get us started, and we're excited, and we're so happy to also see Heidi back with us. Heidi has been very dedicated to Plan Check NC through the years, and she would be out with us at every meeting, and then all of a sudden we heard that she was moving on to something else, and now she's back, so we're very excited. So welcome back, and Heidi and Craig, it's yours.
Hi, good morning everybody. Very quickly, my name is Heidi Vita Lopez, and I work in the section of the department that takes care of long-range policy planning. So that's also a good fancy word for all the community plans that we work on. And I specifically work on the updates for the Boyle Heights Community Plan update and any other long-range policy efforts in the Northeast.
Well, hi, good morning everybody.
Good morning.
We're doing microphone, we're going to do it. Thank you for being here and for having us, and special thank you to Helene for putting this on.
Yay!
My name is Craig Weber. I've worked in City Hall for about 11 years, and when you work in that building, you start to get the impression that it's a very austere environment, a lot of people in suits, and you start to get the impression that these are the people that run the city. But being in environments like this, it's really a reminder that our stakeholders and our very deeply involved people who live here are the ones who run the city. So I've been working with Helene on different planning things for the last decade. I see a lot of familiar faces here of people that we've worked on other planning issues with. Many of you could actually be teaching a planning 101, I see a few of you. So I want to thank you for your continued involvement with planning and with other city issues. I myself am a fourth generation Angelino, and I really appreciate and love the city, and the fact that there are people involved really means a lot. So I'm prepared to give us a run through on city planning. What I'd like to do is give kind of a general overview of what is the city's general plan, what does that even mean, how is it implemented, how do we look at development projects. So it's fairly high level. I think questions are totally fine, so if you have a question in the midst of something, I'm happy to try to adapt and answer your question. And I've asked Heidi to kind of give a wave when it's getting a little long in time, so we've got 45 minutes. But just to get us started, I wanted to just have kind of a primer question here. Hopefully that font is not too small. But in the planning profession, you end up at public hearings a lot. So a couple weeks ago, with a staff team, we're at a hearing on the west side, where the city is looking at changing some of the single-family zoning restrictions, basically changing how big a house you can build and what's the general shape of a house. And one of these comments came up during the public comment. It said, "I can't believe that the city thinks it can tell us what to do with our private property. This is absurd." And actually the comment was with an English accent, so it was even much more absurd. And I just wonder if anyone has any general response to this. Is it absurd? Is it not?
No.
Yes and no. Yes and no. All right.
I just want to know, is this slideshow going to be available online, or should we take notes?
I would recommend taking notes. I'll try to make it available online. There's a lot of like animation things that kind of fly in on top, so just
happy to post it on Plan Check later.
we'll post it.
Okay, perfect.
The slideshow by itself is about 70%, useful. So the question at hand, is it absurd that the city would tell somebody what they can and can't do with their private property?
It is when they're excessive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a general rule that there are things that don't
So yes and no, depends on the circumstances. If the circumstances match, there's actually a great word for that. Other thoughts?
Depends on whether you agree with it.
It depends philosophically. Do I agree with what's happening or not?
If it affects the neighbors in a disastrous negative way.
Okay. If it affects the neighbors in a disastrous negative way, maybe one or two other thoughts. In the back there?
I think that, well, property parcels might be owned by an individual. They exist within the context of a community. They don't exist within isolation of each other. They affect each other. The idea that we can live as somewhat of an island where what we do on our own private property doesn't have some spillover on the surrounding neighborhood and vice versa is not realistic.
Sounds like socialism.
We can say that now, though.
Yeah, there and there, and then I'll move us along.
I would think that depending what you bought your property as, if the city changes it, that would be problematic.
True. So if you bought your property thinking one thing and it's changed,
Right.
that could be problematic.
Changing the rules in the middle isn't exactly
Sure, and we have to
fair.
go to painstaking efforts to let you know when something like that's happening. Okay, and then there was one other comment over here.
The mansionization was one of those cases which definitely impacted the various communities. And it changes the character of the community so much. And as long as it is one-story, single-family dwellings, you have one character of the community. But when you start putting in these mansions, it certainly changes the property tax rates and everything. It's not comfortable.
And the look of the community.
And the look of the community. So I'm going to give us just a quick dash of high school civics to kind of build a foundation for why does a city get to do planning. So we all remember our three branches of government, right? There's the legislative branch, they write and adopt the laws. In the local context, that's your city council. There's the executive branch of government that enforces laws. What's the executive branch in the city? It's the office of the mayor. And then there's the judicial branch. There's not really a city analog in that case, but the role of the judicial is to analyze the law to make sure that it's constitutionally appropriate. So because cities and municipalities have been trying to tell people what to do with their private property for centuries, really, there's been a lot of thought given to, can a city, yes or no, are you allowed to make zoning requirements? Are you allowed to tell people what to do with their private property? And it's all fundamentally based in what's referred to as the police power of the government. So the government actually has an obligation to protect health, safety, and welfare. And based on a couple of the comments that you heard, if something disastrous is happening, if it's going to have a negative impact on neighbors, you can start to see how these general categories, health, safety, and welfare, could come up in terms of what the city can and can't do to regulate property. So this is, there's a lot of casework and things that have gone to the Supreme Court. One of the old cases that we love to talk about, Euclid versus Ambler. This is where a city decided to start saying we're going to separate uses, so factories go over there, houses maybe not next to the factories, that's probably a bad idea. That created a lot of controversy. The courts actually said, yeah, cities can protect health, safety, and welfare by saying if you're going to be, chrome plating over here, maybe people shouldn't be next to all those chemicals, so put them over there. So there's a basis, but it can get a little bit wonkish in terms of where is that line, especially when we're talking about welfare of the public. Health and safety, that's maybe a little easier to identify. Welfare, well, that starts to get more into things like neighborhood character. We're all going to be safe if the house next door is ugly, but is it really protecting our welfare? What about things like I used to get sunlight in my kitchen window and now I don't anymore, and so on. So I just wanted to get sort of a basis for why we do what we do. And so here we are. So your city has a Department of City Planning. There are about 300 staff in the department. Our general goal is to maintain and update and implement the city's general plan. I don't think that's what our mission statement actually is. It's much more touchy-feely. But we are the long-range planners for the city. We work with stakeholders in deciding what is the long-range vision for our communities. And then we work on implementing what that vision actually is. So we have a department head, that's Vince Bertoni. There are about 300 staff in the Department of City Planning. And then there are a number of commissions that are a part of the department as well. So decision-making authority is spread around to a lot of different parties. So we have the City Planning Commission, we have area planning commissions, we have a Cultural Heritage Commission, There are local design review boards and historic preservation overlay boards. So there's a lot of decision making, and this burden of protecting the health, safety, and welfare is really spread around to a lot of different parties. That is not visible, and that's a fantastic. This is a chart of city bureaucracy. So you've got your different kinds of up here. You've got your elected officials. One step below, you've got departments with commissions that oversee them. Below that are different kinds of departments. So planning is hanging out right here in the middle amidst a sea of bureaucracy. And generally when people complain about dealing with bureaucracy from the outside, I think the retort in my head is, can you imagine what it's like working inside this? So cities are obligated to plan for their stakeholders to protect health, safety, and welfare, and that can look differently in a lot of different states. So it's generally relegated to the states. Figure out a framework to make this work in your state. So in the state of California, we have the Office of Planning and Research, OPR, who generally dictate, hey cities, here's how it's gonna work. Every city is gonna have a general plan, which is essentially the 20-year-ish blueprint for how is a city gonna grow, what are its priorities, how are you gonna manage all that growth, etc. And those, our general plans in the state of California are required to address 7 particular elements. So we have to have a land use element, we have to have a housing element, circulation, which generally means transportation or mobility. You have to address open space, conservation, public safety, and noise. So for decades, these have been the 7 things that are the most important themes that need to be addressed in a general plan. Now, of course, because Los Angeles is the large, unwieldy beast that it is, we have a number of additional elements. There's nothing that says you can't have more, and there's nothing that says you can't mash a couple of topics into one element. So at a very high level, we have the framework element in the city of Los Angeles, which is kind of like an organizing, here's how it's going to work across this unwieldy city. We don't have just a land use element, so we have our 35 community plans instead, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we have this myriad of other elements. So we don't have a circulation element, we have a mobility element. We have a housing element, which is updated very, very regularly. We're actually obligated to keep that up to date every 4 years instead of every 15-ish. And so what I want to do is delve into what do these general plan elements mean, and then how are they implemented. So we're going to kind of start high level and try to kind of, at the end of the day, arrive at, do you get a building permit for this, yes or no? Maybe just a snapshot back. So question.
I have a comment, because when I didn't get to comment on the first round, but kind of related to his comment, like it's ridiculous the city could tell what to do. I think that's really like a lack of awareness of what city planning is, and whether he had an accent or not, I think a lot of people don't understand city planning, and especially community planning. And I was just thinking, this is great that you're teaching us this, but are there ways that you can also help us neighborhood council people and neighbors educate the rest of the city, simple things, a web page or...
I sure hope so, yes.
Or your community planning program,
Yeah, so we try to get out there as much as possible. Our department is actually in the process of hiring a communications director, which we've never had one, which is shock and awe. So I would hope that that's going to help us convince, because there are a lot of people trying to be involved, and there's a real learning curve into all this material, and we really do need to do a better job. And because you don't want people showing up to your hearing having no idea what this is really about, or hey, it's absurd that you could tell us what to do with our property. Well, it's not really, but if you're really doing your job great, people would have those facts ahead of time so that you can show up and say, actually, I just don't like the zoning regulation. Could you change this to that? Rather than these foundational, why are we even here? So point taken, and education is an ongoing obligation for all city departments, and we could always do better. So in the 1970s, the city adopted what's today known as the centers concept. So by then it was pretty apparent Los Angeles is a booming metropolis, perhaps a little bit sprawly. We're different from a lot of cities in that downtown doesn't seem to be our only hub. And so this centers vision was cast, where we acknowledged, yes, Los Angeles is actually a city of multiple urban centers. And so our goal is going to be to grow in those centers, to connect them with transit and open space. And so you ended up with this, I mean, it looks like a watercolor. It was a very abstract vision. There were policies that went along with this, but it was kind of a foundational, this was a foundational approach to how are we going to go about growing in the future. And this concept has stuck with us for years and years. So in the 1990s, the city adopted the framework element of the general plan. And the basic idea was, this is going to be the philosophy around how the city grows, how it prioritizes where it's going to grow, and what our general priorities are about land use. And this element remains adopted today and is both the lowercase f and the larger case f framework for land use planning in the city. And there are three basic concepts that came with the framework element. So when people tell you that there's no planning in LA, you can rebuff at that dinner party with these three general things. This is what city planning foundationally is in Los Angeles. So first, it is to focus growth in the city around transit and around employment centers. So let's all picture the subway stop we're perhaps most familiar with. The goal would be to grow around that subway stop. The goal would be to grow around places like around the media district in Hollywood, around downtown, around Warner Center in the Valley. That's where you want your population growth to go. For perhaps simple reasons, there's going to be less commuting if people live closer to work, if people live closer to transit. So it was to focus growth in those areas. It was to conserve residential neighborhoods. So this has been in our DNA for a while. The idea that Los Angeles has special, low-density, both single-family and apartment neighborhoods. And those are really, that's kind of our cachet. This is what makes Los Angeles pretty fantastic. And so we're invested in conserving those neighborhoods. So those were two things. And then the third was to preserve land, industrial land in particular, for job growth. The city's going to need to continue to invest in job growth. That's really important to us. So those were the three basic fundamentals of the framework element. And then you sort of had this mapped concept of, well, what are these centers? So the framework element devised a hierarchy of land use designations. So this is a map of just what's referred to in the framework as Metro LA. So this is kind of northeast, downtown, Hollywood, Wilshire. So you've got your downtown center called out as special. That's this kind of trapezoid in the middle. In the darker blobs, you've got your regional centers. So those were going to be really where the larger buildings were envisioned, where a lot of growth was envisioned. You've got your kind of lighter gray blobs on the map. Those were your community centers. So again, maybe to a lesser degree, you're focusing activity and growth around there. And then they were going to be connected by these mixed-use boulevards. So that was the basic idea of the framework adopted in the 90s. But it's a little esoteric. It's up here. There aren't any laws that come with the framework element. There's nothing that says, hey, you're going to build right here for sure, and it's going to be exactly 150 feet tall, and this is your setback. It's just policies that are useful for stakeholders, that are useful for your city council in making decisions. So it's up here, and it's at the policy level. So then the city has all of these other general plan elements. We have a housing element. The basic idea of the housing element is to make sure that we're providing enough housing in the city, that housing is safe and livable, that there are new housing opportunities. We want to prevent and end homelessness. But again, it's a lot of policies that are kind of up here at the 30,000 foot level. And this is a snapshot of what, let me just finish this thought. No. So this is a snapshot of what a general plan element looks like. You've got a list of, there are goals, and then there are objectives, and there are policies, but no laws. So here, if we look on this screen, I'm just going to read a couple of the policies. You have expand affordable home ownership opportunities and support current home ownership. And then I can't read the rest of that. But I think you get the basic idea. So these, again, there's no mandate. It's just we want to expand housing opportunities. So the question is, well, where's the law? What does this really mean? So it's up to the city and stakeholders to find ways to implement these sort of policies. So one example of an implementation measure of that general policy, let's find ways to expand housing opportunities, was, well, let's adopt an ordinance that allows the city to build different types of housing. So several years ago, the small lot ordinance was created that said, actually, we're going to let you subdivide in a different kind of way so we can have these standalone row house style houses. It's going to be a new type of housing. It's going to fill a gap between a house, which maybe costs about this much, and renting, which is over here. So we're going to try to find a spot in the middle. That was the goal of that program. This was the implementing law for that program, or one of what could have been many implementing laws. So I think even just as I said the word small lot subdivision, so did the city stick the landing on adopting that tool? I think that there's a valid discussion to be had on that. This ordinance has been amended once. It's in the process of being amended yet again to effectuate better design guidelines. Have there been local issues in communities of surprise, out-of-scale construction? Absolutely. But I just call this out as an example of when you've got your high-level policy, let's have better housing opportunities, and then you need to find an implementation program to actually do something. Maybe there would have been a different approach, but that's just an example of one approach. There's a question up front.
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned that a lot of these departments have commissions. Is there a commission behind the housing department?
This is my ignorance of other agencies within the city. Is there a commission for the housing department?
Yeah, we have the housing commission for, it's now called HSID, but it's the housing department, and they have their own commission as well.
Oh.
So the mayor assigns somebody to be a part of those commissions.
Okay, and then there's also obviously a housing committee at the council level as well. So that's an example of an implementation program for the general plan, how you take esoteric policy and try to actually do something with it. So then the city, land use I think is probably the area of greatest interest with this group. So I mentioned earlier, the city of Los Angeles doesn't have a land use element. Life would be probably a lot easier for us if we did in some ways. What we've done is divided our land use element into these 35 community plans. So you can see them tiled there on the map. These boundaries have existed for decades. I like to think of them, and we really have to think of them, as administrative boundaries. So they don't always resonate with, I don't think that's what I think of as my community, because some of them are quite large. So, you've got Sunland, Tahunga, Shadow Hills, Lakeview Terrace, East La Tuna Canyon. That's a single community plan area. It's a very large geography. Obviously, that's many communities. Boyle Heights, that's one where those boundaries actually do, I think, sort of coincide with what most people would think of as Boyle Heights, but a lot of them are very, it's Wilshire, but it's also this and it's also that. They're just administrative boundaries for the city to be able to make land use decisions. I often say I think neighborhoods in Los Angeles are more ideas than when you go to someplace like Chicago, where you can, this is Austin, this is not, it's very clear. We have been working on community plans for decades. There's an ongoing obligation for us to keep these up to date. Yes, question?
Just a question on the community plans. How often do they have to be updated? And I know that the emergency delay when it's a couple of years, so I think it was late 1990s that it was that's updated.
Yeah, you're touching a nerve with that question. So, with most general plan elements, I mentioned the housing element has to be updated much more periodically. Every 4 years is the state obligation. Generally speaking, the shelf life of other land use elements is approximately 15 to 20 years. So there's not a mandate from the state of how often. It's really for the city to decide. It may be that some elements you really don't need to burn into every 15 years. If your noise element was great the first time, you're going to open that up in 15 years and maybe make a couple new considerations about noise. But you may not need to dive into that. Community plans, or the land use element on the other hand, there probably is going to be a need for more ongoing updates. So 15 years is kind of the talking number. The majority of the city's community plans were updated in the late 90s to early 2000s. So there are approximately 10 that are more current than that. So 2 years ago we updated Sylmar and Granada Hills. Just last year we updated West Adams. There are a handful of others that are about to move through the adoption process. So South Los Angeles, Southeast, Hollywood will be happening in 2017. Boyle Heights will be happening in 2018. The downtown plans will be happening in 2018. But the pace at which we're updating these has not been adequate to keep them all up to date in a reasonable amount of time. So that's actually touches on some very exciting developments in the city realm. In the city's budget, in the most recent update to its budget, significant resources were given to the department to more expeditiously update these community plans. So that program is just now ramping up. So we've got 8 that are kind of in the hopper, and we're wrapping those up, and they're really fantastic plans. And we are now ramping up on a new planning effort in the Valley, and then as these other ones come to completion in 2017 and 2018, we're going to be ramping up much larger teams. So the goal with this program, and then, because I suspect that the sort of, when are we going to update my community plan, how fast this is going to go, I think we're going to want to talk about that a lot, so maybe we'll shelf that to the end, because I do want to get to kind of the nuts and bolts of what even is a community plan. So the basic idea, though, is that, if I can move back to my community plan map, the city's going to be tackling groups of plans at one time. Previously, hey, you're going to go to Sunland, you're over there in San Pedro, so there's a whole outreach effort happening here, you're doing a whole EIR all by itself over there. We haven't really been using economies of scale. So the basic idea is going to be to tackle groups of plans at one time, so you can talk to whole communities holistically, you can study the environmental effects more holistically, and hopefully create a more accurate picture of what the environmental effects of that plan would be. And then you're going to adopt those at the same time and then move on to another group. So the goal with this program is for the city to cycle through all of the community plans within a 10-year period. And even today, the council is hemming and hawing, can we get this going any faster? Can we find some additional money to build additional teams? So that still remains a possibility. So let's take a couple questions on that and then move it along. So there was one there, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to move along, okay?
I have a question more to your staff. You said that your department's 300 people. How many planners are there?
So of I don't have exact numbers, but there are about 400 positions in the department. 300 of those are filled. So there's a lot of bureaucracy that goes around. How fast can you fill positions? Oh, she retired. Now we're back to. So of the 300, approximately 250, maybe between 225 to 250 are planning staff. So that's someone with the word planner in their title and probably a degree in that field. The remaining staff would be accounting staff, systems staff, support staff, management analysts, people that kind of help keep the machinery running.
Okay, what I'm asking is how many planners does it take to do a community plan?
Yeah. So, right? These are good philosophical questions. I don't know. No. So with this budget program, the way that we've looked at it, and this is going to be much better because previously, I mean, I'm airing a little dirty laundry here, but in the early 2000s, or really the mid 2000s, when we were ramping up in kind of the Gail Goldberg years, we're going to do new community plans. It was a one-staff effort. Hey, you're a planning assistant. You've been here for a year. Why don't you go ahead and get started on San Pedro? So those staff did a fantastic. I mean, you're a part-time event planner. You're a part-time land use expert. You're now working. I mean, it was not the most sustainable model. So what we're looking at now with these teams, you're going to be a team. You're going to tackle a group of plans in the valley together. That team's going to have a senior planner. It's going to have 3 city planners, and it's going to have 6 planning staff. That's going to be the team that is working on this group of plans. And then to complement that, we're looking at having GIS staff. We're looking at additional support staff, clerical. And then also the budget program came with additional city attorney resources and Department of Transportation resources. So it was much more of a soup to nuts look at what do we really need to get these plans done. So that's the basic idea. Is that going to be the perfect mix? Time will tell. But it's a much better look at resources than we've had in the past. And over here, hi.
Hi, just to your point of administrative boundaries, so that kind of means that it's not legal, it's not legally required, but it's something that I guess and I'm just wondering if you've considered the neighborhood council boundaries now, because those are very fixed and very formal. And there's a lot of land use planning committee at each neighborhood council, maybe a string of neighborhood councils that are kind of in an overlap. I mean, are you looking at some new boundaries maybe for this next?
We're not. We're not. There are a million great reasons why we could. Some of those would give us much smaller community plan boundaries. So it's, we're already like Sisyphus pushing this rock up the hill 35 times. Probably dividing that number in like 96 times or is not going to get us there any faster. It's just going to kind of dilute the program. I personally have been in the camp of let's change these boundaries here and there when it makes sense. A lot of them, it's like the freeway runs right here and then the boundaries just beside them. I mean, like the Silver Lake plan doesn't use the 101 as a boundary, it uses Temple, so you end up with this sliver of land. But I mean, there is some admitted silliness in the boundaries, and there is seriously, you're never going to get to us because you're over there working on this monster plan area. Those are all, I think, valid concerns. The wealth of statistical information that we have in keeping static administrative boundaries is actually very beneficial for the department in understanding how have these plan areas changed over time. When you start slicing and dicing, it becomes harder and harder to have kind of consistent information for statistical purposes. The boundaries themselves are a legal framework, so there's no law that says these are what your boundaries are. The law is, this is what we think our boundaries are. So at the end of the day, one could, the city could decide absolutely we want to change it. To date, the department wouldn't recommend that kind of change for just a few of the reasons that I've touched on, but I do understand what the other viewpoints are as well. So there was, I think, there were two other, and then we're going to soldier on, and then the rest of our seriously update my community plan questions we'll kind of pull toward the end. Hi.
All right, you were mentioning something about 15 to 20 years on the community plans. Now, I'm very low on the learning curve for land use, but I have been told that every 10 years of the census, followed by the redistricting, that we should also be redoing the community plans. Now, one of the things I have learned in the 9 years of working in the neighborhood council system is that you can get different answers to the same question. And I wonder, is there any validity to that census redistricting community plan theory?
It sounds sensible in some ways. The reality is you're never gonna, or very seldom will your community plan effort coincide with when the census figures come out. So it's not really the case that we get to wait for, it's 2021, we just got the 2020 census numbers, now let's go. And then, I mean, that would be a perfect snapshot of time. You would have this great foundation of here's what we know about existing conditions and moving forward. Office of Planning Research just suggested 15 to 20 years independent of what the census says. So I feel like I'm dancing around your question, but it really is, at the end of the day, it's a question of city resources and how quickly can we move through this program. And then really how long are the land use recommendations of the community plan really valid? So if there's a corner of Chatsworth that we've said, it's gonna be single family over here, that street over there is gonna have some really low density commercial, it's possible that that vision makes sense for 15 to 20 years, and you may not need to go out to Chatsworth in 7.5 years and say, so how's it going with the single family houses? But then there are other parts of the city where change is happening much more dynamically, and it would make sense to be out there more readily.
Well, part of my question is that the neighborhood council in which I live has 2 community plans. I'm sure that other neighborhood councils may have a similar situation, but is there going to be a problem in upgrading one and maybe having a delay on the second one, or do we have to upgrade both of them at the same time?
Well, I'm going to guess most folks, are we all neighborhood council, we're all involved in neighborhood councils. I'm going to bet many of your neighborhood councils have more than one community plan boundary. So there's not consistency with community plan boundaries, with council districts, with neighborhood council areas. Those are all different. So as a neighborhood council member, if you span both Wilshire and Hollywood's being updated, perhaps, there's no wood to knock on. Hollywood's being updated, but Wilshire, it's gonna be another couple years, then you have a new plan to get familiar with north of Melrose, and you've got your slightly more vintage plan to continue to be familiar with until it's updated again. So there was a question in the back, and then I'm gonna move us on through the presentation.
It's kind of a two-part thing. One of the questions is, if the city is looking at grouping these revisions of the community plans together, it sort of defeats unless there's something I'm not hearing, it sort of defeats the purpose of these community plans and the boundaries, because those areas were sort of looked at unique areas that should have a special treatment. So if it's all being done grouping them together when you do it, how do you protect and preserve those distinct natures of those areas? Plus, I'm in the Warner Center area, and on the neighborhood council there, and the specific plan there changed a year or two ago, and now we're being like overrun by very large development. And our concern is we're not getting any infrastructure. There's no new roads. I don't know that there's enough water or electricity. We have a drought that will probably continue because weather's changing and population is growing, and we're not watering our lawns, but we're getting 40,000 more people in our area, and that's just the beginning. So how are you dealing with these different areas distinctly?
Yeah, so you still need to have a conversation with each of those plan areas about the goals and objectives and needs of that community. So if I'm sitting down with Encino, Tarzana, and Chatsworth, we still have to talk with each of you. We still have to figure out what are the issues, where are the opportunities for growth, what zone changes are we going to make and aren't we? And those conversations are individual with stakeholders from each of those areas. It just so happens that our efforts are consolidated around one area. So the goal isn't to, at the end of the day, erase Encino, Tarzana, Chatsworth and just, it's all the same thing. It's really just to have the same conversation with people in the same corner of the city at the same time and to study the environmental effects more holistically. So hopefully we're still capturing the needs of individual plan areas. The Warner Center question is almost maybe what that's touching on. I mean, the Warner Center specific plan itself there's a nexus study, there are infrastructure improvements that are intended to match the growth that that plan is pulling off. So there really is a quid pro quo with that plan of if you're building this much, you're obligated to do these types of street improvements. You're also giving funds to the stakeholder group to figure out how to manage spillover traffic, et cetera. So there was a lot of labor that went into that infrastructure conversation in particular in Warner Center. So hopefully we're seeing the effects of infrastructure improvements that come along with the growth there. But I think if you step out of Warner Center, where there really was this micromanaged conversation that hopefully is being properly executed, that is an ongoing obligation of the city to figure out how do you link infrastructure and growth, and how do you do it in a way that stakeholders are getting the infrastructure improvements that they need, but that the city is actually growing in a way that it's going to need to have continued economic development, to have continued opportunities for our children to have a place to live and work, et cetera. And that's a very, very hard conversation to have. So I'm going to move us through the rest, and then we're going to have time for question and answer at the end. So in these community plans, same idea. We've got goals and policies, but there aren't necessarily any laws. But with community plans, there actually are a couple of things that are binding. So first, you've got your community plan map. A lot of the presentation here is going to be very focused around Northeast Los Angeles. So if you're familiar with this territory already, then you're in luck. So on this map, land use designations are made. So before, when we were looking at that framework map, there was a bunch of blobs. So there's no way to really tell, well, if I live at 4279 La Mirada, which part of the blob am I in? That doesn't really work that way. It's just they're conceptual blobs. But at the community plan level with these land use designations, this is at the parcel level. So every property has a general plan land use designation. The city will use general plan and community plan land use designation interchangeably, so let's think of them as one and the same. So everybody's getting a land use designation, and these are binding. And then this map also has a list of footnotes, and those are also binding. So while the rest of that general plan stuff was a little bit up here and a little bit policy, these are actually binding. And this is what you may be reading or hearing a lot about in the news with these general plan amendments. And how is the city going to rein in general plan amendments? When people are applying for general plan amendments, they're applying to change the designation of land use on their lot. So we're going to zoom in a little bit because this map is, I realize, a little hard to read. But you do at the bottom see this table with some very fuzzy text next to it. So every land use designation has a list of corresponding zones. So here's a zoom in on where we are today, and you can see the yellows and the blues and the greens, and those are land use designation colors. And so for each land use designation, there are a list of zones that go with it. And then with those zones, are all the laws of what you can and can't build and how you can and can't use the property. So these are low-density residential designations. So in the, where's R1? R1 is in the low, so there's a popular land use designation low. These are the zones that you could have. So you've got RE9, that's residential estate. You've got RS, residential suburban, R1, there's a lot of R1 in the city. So those are the only zones that you're allowed to have. So when developers are wanting to do something else, it's because the zone doesn't work, number one, but also none of the other zones in that menu of options work. So we see a lot of zone change cases in the city that leave the general plan alone. I just want to change to a different zone that's allowed, and there's a process for that. And then there's the, none of these zones would even work, so could we think about a different general plan land use designation? And there may be pros and cons to each case that comes along that way. But that's the basic idea, is you've got your land use designations and you've got your corresponding zones. So this is where the laws come into place. So with the R1 zone, there's a place in our municipal code that tells you everything you can and can't do with your R1 lot. You can have a single family house. It can be so big, it can be so tall. No, you can't use it as a fat rendering plant. It can only be a single family house, etc. So I want to kind of break this down and what this means in the zone strand, because this is probably stuff you see in hearing notices and what is this gobbledygook. So in the case of these yellow properties that you see here, they're all zoned R1-1. I guess I put 1BL there. So the first part is the use. What uses are you allowed to have? In case of R1, it's single family. And then the second part is the height district. So the height district is intended to deal with building size. So you've got your use over here, and you've got your building size over here. And that really regulates two things: the overall height of a building, and then the floor area ratio. Are people familiar with floor area ratio? Anyone not familiar? I'm going to do a quick demo, and then we'll move on. Because this is important, and this is kind of foundational in terms of how we regulate stuff in the city. So you've got just sort of an axonometric of a piece of property. Let's say this is a 10,000 square foot piece of property. If you have a 1.5 to 1 floor area ratio, what that's saying is that you can build 1.5 times the amount of area that you have in your lot. So 10,000 square foot lot, you can build, in the simplest terms, that would mean you could build 1.5 times. That's kind of a sloppy drawing of, this is how much floor area you get. Now it doesn't mean that your building is shaped like this. In reality, you're going to have some parking here, you're going to have some landscaping, so you're going to need to arrange that floor area differently. But with your 10,000 square foot lot, when you have a 1.5 to 1 floor area ratio, you're allowed how much floor area? 15,000. So, and usually floor area is dealt with in increments in the city. So most of our commercial land allows a 1.5 to 1 floor area ratio. Most of our residential land allows a 3 to 1 floor area ratio. Not single family lots, not anymore. That's down to about 0.5. And then in more urban parts of the city, you'll start to see outside of Height District 1, this it starts with a 1, you'll see 2 or 3, and that's where you're more likely to see much higher floor area ratios. The tallest or the most floor area that you can get in the city right now without a transfer of floor area is downtown, and that's 13 to 1. So let's talk a little bit about by right development. So with that R1 lot, if I am just wanting to build a house and a family's going to live in it, is there any other consideration that is needed? Do I need to come to the planning department? Is there going to be a public hearing? Are you going to do an environmental impact report on my house? No. So if your land use and your building complies with the zoning, in most circumstances, that's going to be treated as by right development, which is more of a term of art. I don't think you're going to see the phrase by right in the municipal code. But the basic idea is you're just going to go to building and safety. You're going to get your building permit. They're going to make sure the house doesn't fall down. But so long as it complies with the zoning, you're not going to have a community interaction. You're not going to go down to the planning department. It's going to be by right. Generally speaking, in this field, that's what's known as ministerial review. I think the basic idea is no one's having to think too hard about it. These are binary decisions. It's a single family lot. Is it a house? Yes or no? So let's look now at the commercial lots that are sandwiched here between Verdugo and Eagle Rock Boulevard. The zone strand here is much more complicated. So if you kind of filter out the stuff on the side, you've got that C2. In that case, that's telling us it's a commercial zone. You've got the height district, which is giving us the maximum height and the floor area. And then you've got some other junk appended on here. So first you've got a suffix at the end, and that is letting you know that there's a supplemental use district that also regulates land use in this area. So it's not just the zone and the height district, but there are some other special rules, and we'll talk a little bit more about what these are. But for example, it would be where we're standing here, we're surrounded by a community design overlay. There are design guidelines that it's not as simple as, is it a house, yes or no? We're gonna have a conversation about, well, what does your house look like? And yes, you are gonna come to the planning department, and maybe there will be a community interaction. And then also in this zone strand, there are qualified conditions. And this is a unique animal to the city of Los Angeles. Q conditions or qualified conditions are a way for us to tinker with the zone as it exists. So here we've got the C2 zone. C2 lets you do most commercial stuff. You can have a store, you can have a restaurant, you can have an office, you can do auto repair, et cetera, et cetera. And the Q condition allows us to come in and look at a property, or maybe a small grouping of properties, and say, actually, we don't think retail really makes sense here. So yes, it's a C2 zone, but we're going to qualify that by saying no retail, not today. And those are going to be site specific. It's a great tool to really be able to manage land use at the local level. It's not a great tool in that we're littered with thousands upon thousands of these Q condition ordinances, which maybe what they're actually doing is good, but the manner in which they're presented, how hard they are to find and research, is probably has not been our greatest achievement in the planning department. So it's a mixed bag with the Q conditions. So for that commercial lot, it allows most C2 uses. I think we covered this. So the same question about by right development. If I want to open a restaurant on a C2 lot, is any special consideration going to be needed? Hard to say. So generally, if it was just a C2 lot and it's going to be just a restaurant, you're just doing sandwiches or whatever, probably it's going to be a by right development, ministerial review. Oh, but what if the restaurant wants to serve alcohol? Okay, so that's going to be a little bit different, because even in the C2 zone, yes, restaurants are allowed, but there are also a lot of call-outs in the municipal code to do what's called a conditional use. So yes, we think restaurants are okay. Yes, conceptually, we envision that some of those restaurants might serve beer and wine, might even serve a full line of alcohol, but we're going to make you come to us in each and every instance so we can understand what's happening on your property, and we're going to have a public process. So there may be a hearing, there may be an opportunity for stakeholders to comment, it may be decided within the planning department at the end of the day, and then there's an appeal process to go someplace else. Or it may be that the initial decision maker is not even going to be the planning department, it's going to be the city planning commission, or so on. But that's the basic idea, is some uses will be allowed only conditionally. There are other exceptions as well. So yes, an office use in a C2 zone would be fine, but if you're building a commercial office building that's bigger than 50,000 square feet, you're going to go through a process for that, because that's an awfully big building, and we want to make sure that there aren't going to be impacts in the local community. So you're going to go through a thing called site plan review, and you're going to have a special interaction with the community, and it's going to be appealable and so on. So it's no longer by right, it's what's called discretionary review, which is basically planning parlance for, did someone have to think about it this time? So it's not, is it a house? Yes, no. It's, is it a restaurant, or is it serving alcohol, and is that really appropriate for the community? Well, I don't know, I got to think about that. I've got to use some discretion. So that's what that term is intended to imply. This zone strand just can't go away. There's more of the zone strand. Oh, that was just a reminder. So we had these different widgets, and at the end were these supplemental use districts. So I think these are really important in terms of how does the city implement its general plan, especially because our zoning code itself is fairly old, fairly outdated. It's a bit of a Frankenstein. We're in the process of rewriting the code. I think it's a very valuable effort. Hopefully you're involved in that in some way. And I think that this is going to solve the need that we've had in the city to, you know, it's all zone C2, and so we've got to do a bunch of Q conditions over here, and we've got to do some design guidelines over here, because the C2 zone is really a blunt tool, like much of our zoning code. I did see a question or two. Okay. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll close her on.
Okay. On the commercial buildings that have conditional use permits, alcohol permits, et cetera, and they've been issued and the business has been running for years, but they're violating that CDO, that condition, or the conditional
Yeah.
use. What is the community's next steps to get this the commercial building or owners, whatever, to comply? And does the community have a voice in saying, well, you're violating?
That's a great, so the question was fundamentally, we do this conditional use process. The basic idea is, restaurant comes to us, we analyze it, we make some findings, basically we demonstrate why did we approve this. And then we have conditions. So yes, a restaurant's okay, but we really think you should put a sign by your front door that says, shh, please respect our neighbors at nighttime, and we really think your parking should be screened in this kind of way, and we really think your noise should be baffled in this kind of way. So you have all these conditions that say, do this, that, and the next thing. And you cross your fingers and you hope for the best. Early on in my planning career, my job was to do condition compliance for Los Angeles County. So I would, drive to liquor stores and restaurants and look, are they selling single quantity cans of beer, or are they selling 6-packs? Do they have ice? Do they have the signs up that they're supposed to? So number one, the city is obligated to enforce these conditions. We have not historically done a phenomenal job with condition compliance, but a lot has changed in the last 2 years. So number one, the Department of Building and Safety has ramped up its enforcement capacity. Like, this is no longer, it's not even the stuff to joke about anymore in this kind of setting. It really, the city needs to do a better job with condition compliance. So Building and Safety has responded and has increased its enforcement capacity. And the Department of City Planning in the last 2 years has created a condition compliance unit, the job of which is to go through all of these conditional uses. They all have a shelf life. And they all say, in 5 years, you're going to come back, and we're going to see how it's going. Or, yours was kind of dicey, you're going to come back in 1 year. But even the enforcement of that, you're going to come back, has been a little lackluster up until the last couple of years. So we're actually bringing people back. There's a new process. Hey, you've been open for 2 years. How's it going? And stakeholders get to come and say, actually, it's been really loud, and there have been problems, and we should have additional conditions. So there's a process, and there are a lot of steps that are geared toward getting compliance. I think at the end of that, once you've exhausted and you're no longer getting compliance, there's a process for revocation. So we do see cases revoked, perhaps not enough to some viewpoints, but generally what you see going through the revocation process tend to be motels with really unsavory situations happening, liquor stores, like the really hairy land uses, those are kind of called out first to be kind of dragged through the revocation process. And in some cases, these permits are revoked. So that's what the process looks like. Is it fail-safe every single time? Probably not. There was, okay, it's Carrie, right? Hi, yes.
Can you just talk a little bit more about these conditions? I see them, and I know that Elysian Valley is supposed to,
Yeah, so
but where do you find out what they need?
So we're actually going to have a demo of ZIMAS, which is the city's mapping system, and there's an opportunity to show you how to do that Q research. The easiest way to think of them is they're just an ordinance. Zoning is just an ordinance, which means it's just a law on a piece of paper that the council said yes to. And then the Q condition is another ordinance that relates to that one. So the first law said, build whatever commercial stuff you want. Offices, restaurants, go for it. And then the second law said, yeah, but right here on Eagle Rock Boulevard, no offices, or whatever the case might be. So it's really just it's a law that qualifies that first one. And they are standalone ordinances, and it's a little bit of doing to know where to find them, which this is sort of the downside to the Q. So we'll show you where to find those. So the other implementing program, so zoning can be fantastic. Hopefully our new code is going to be really fantastic and address the needs of stakeholders really well. But until that, we have these supplemental use districts. So there are several types of supplemental use districts. Here in Northeast Los Angeles, there are 3 specific plans. So a specific plan is where you say, hey, zoning's great, but actually we're going to really just rewrite all of the land use requirements for this area. and they may relate to, or they may completely erase zoning and just have a whole new set of rules. So in Northeast Los Angeles, we have the Cornfield Arroyo specific plan, which is really dealing with underutilized industrial land near the LA River. It's dealing with new transit stations. So it's basically, okay, we can't just zone this all industrial and hope for the best. We have really specific goals about revitalizing the river, about maximizing our transit infrastructure, about job growth. So we're going to have regulations that are really focused on this area. We're going to look at this area and we're going to really specify what the land use regulations are. You have the Mount Washington Glassell Park specific plan. So that's regulating land use on the hilltop right here. Again, if this is all zoned R1, that's probably fine on flat land, but when you have hilly topography and really weird shaped lots, maybe you want to have some more specific regulations to deal with that type of hillside development. And then we also have the Avenue 57 TOD, which again is a specific plan around a transit station in the Highland Park area. This is just Northeast LA examples. You also have community design overlays. So community design overlays aren't really looking at land use. They're not going to get into can you have an office or not, can you do a restaurant or not, but they are going to look at building design. And they're going to look at it in more qualifiable terms. So it's not zoning. You can only have 35 feet in height. You can only have X amount of parking spaces. But it's going to look at things like neighborhood character and consistency of design. So the Glassell Park CDO, which we're surrounded by here, is really looking at pedestrian orientation, making sure that there are doors and windows that face the street of buildings, that parking areas are very well landscaped, and so on. So it's building design. There's another CDO in Lincoln Heights that's aimed both at those goals and also protecting historic architecture. And the basic idea is that, well, let me hold that thought for one moment. We also have historic preservation overlay zones, and those are throughout the city. So in Northeast Los Angeles, we have the city's largest, the Highland Park Garvanza HPOZ, and then we also have the Lincoln Heights HPOZ. So that is regulating changes to historic architecture. And there's a process for when you want to paint your house, when you want to do an addition, when you think you're going to demolish that house, but you're probably not going to at the end of the day. And the basic idea with all of these is that because you're in that geography, even if your use is allowed, hey, I'm just building a house, I'm in an R1 zone, what's the big deal? You're going to be in a process with the city. You're going to file an application. Someone at the city is going to review your application and make sure that what you're doing is consistent with that specific plan, with that community design overlay, with that historic district. There may be a design review board that is also going to look at it, or an HPOZ board, and then a decision will be made that is appealable. So the department can make its decision, oh yeah, this building looks great, it totally complies with the Cypress Park CDO, but stakeholders may disagree. Actually, you forgot to make them do a door facing the street, and the CDO says, doors facing the street, what's the deal? And so you would appeal, and then there'd be a public process at an area planning commission. So that's the basic idea in terms of additional implementing tools. So maybe we can pause there and take some questions. How are we doing on time though?
We need to wrap up the presentation,
Okay.
and then we could allow for Q&A.
Okay, so what we'll do is just move quickly through these last couple of slides then. So this brings us to cases. We had the general plan way up here. We had how is it implemented? Well, through the general plan land use map, and then through zoning, and then through all of these supplemental use districts. And at the end of the day, what does that create? That creates a bunch of cases. That creates people coming to the department with a check and a big fat stack of paper and some plans saying, hey, could you please review this and let's get going. And so if you're involved in neighborhood councils, these are probably coming to you all the time. So there's a hierarchy to these cases. And you see the case number, and it's a gobbledygook of numbers and letters. So this is going to help you kind of understand and navigate what are all those. So first what we're looking at is the type of decision makers with each of these cases. So you've got your director decisions, the idea being the director of planning or his or her designee, so that's staff like us, are doing the decision making on those. And then they're appealable elsewhere. Then you've got a zoning administrator. So the director is doing most of those HPOZs, the community design overlays, site plan review, and then you've got your zoning administrator. And the zoning administrator is the decision maker for all of the zoning stuff, things like conditional uses and variances. A variance is, I can't really comply with the zoning. You said that my setback needs to be 15 feet, but there's like this giant rock outcrop on my property and it's not on anyone else's property. Can I have 12 feet? And you would have a process to decide is 12 feet reasonable in this circumstance. At the next level, you have the advisory agency. Does anyone know what the advisory agency makes decisions on? Subdivisions, yes. Some of you have been doing this for a while. So anytime you're chopping up land in a different kind of way, the advisory agency makes that decision. And then you've got